The war for independence ended, not with fireworks, but with silence. In September of 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and for the first time, the British Empire recognized the United States of America. On paper, a miracle. In reality, a mystery. Because when the smoke cleared, when the muskets were laid down and the redcoats sailed away, there was no map for what came next. No president, no constitution, no blueprint for how to be a nation. What stood in the ashes of revolution wasn't the America we know. It was 13 separate states, bound by victory, but divided by fear. Each with its own currency, its own trade laws, its own suspicion of the other. They called themselves a confederation, but it was more like a handshake among strangers, one that could easily slip away. The Continental Army disbanded. Thousands of soldiers went home unpaid, carrying scars and IOUs. The government, if you could call it that, had no money, no real authority, and no capital city to speak of. Even George Washington, the man who had led them to freedom, quietly returned to Mount Vernon. He'd won the war, but could anyone win the peace? Abigail Adams wrote that the revolution is not over when the war ends, and she was right, because this was the fragile dawn of a country still deciding what freedom meant. Was it the liberty of states to go their own way, or the unity of one nation under one law? In that uneasy silence after the revolution, the world watched. Would America become the shining example it promised to be, or collapse back into the chaos it had just escaped? The answer wouldn't come from the battlefield. It would come from the pen, the vote, and the courage to start over, again. Before there was a constitution, before there was even a president, there was a document held together by hope and fear. They called it the Articles of Confederation, drafted in the heat of war, signed in the spirit of survival. It was America's first attempt at self-government, and it was already falling apart. The Articles created a Congress, but not a government. There was no executive branch, no national court, no power to tax or enforce its laws. Each state, large or small, had one vote, and more importantly, one escape hatch. If a state didn't like a law, it could simply ignore it. It was government by suggestion, and suggestion doesn't build a nation. The men who wrote the Articles weren't fools. They'd just escaped the grip of a monarchy, a government that taxed without consent, ruled without mercy. So they built its opposite, a weak union designed to keep power far from the center. But in their effort to avoid tyranny, they created paralysis. By 1784, Congress couldn't pay its soldiers, couldn't pay its debts, couldn't even guarantee the borders it had just fought for. The currency was worthless, not worth a continental, people said. Merchants refused American paper, demanding gold, or worse, British coins. Across the countryside, farmers watched their crops rot as states imposed tariffs on each other like foreign nations. Virginia taxed goods from Maryland, New York taxed goods from Connecticut. The dream of one America was dissolving into 13. And while politicians in Philadelphia debated, foreign powers circled. Britain still held forts along the Great Lakes. Spain closed the Mississippi River, and France, once ally, now creditor, wanted its money back. The Articles of Confederation had won a revolution, but it couldn't win peace. By the mid-1780s, even the most loyal patriots began to whisper a dangerous thought. Had they traded one form of tyranny for another kind of failure? What the war had given birth to, independence, was now threatening to destroy the very idea of the United States. But in that weakness, something was stirring, a realization that freedom without order is just another kind of chaos. And soon, a rebellion in the heart of Massachusetts would ignite the spark that forced America to face its truth and start again. By 1786, the Revolution's promise was fading, replaced by hunger, debt, and disillusion. The men who had fought to free America returned home to find their farms seized, their savings worthless, and their government powerless. They'd traded one empire's taxes for another kind of tyranny, this time from their own states. In Massachusetts, the anger turned to action. Farmers, many of them veterans, took up arms once more, but not against the British, against their own courts. Their leader was a farmer named Daniel Shays, a man who had once fought at Bunker Hill. Now he marched with hundreds toward the courthouses of western Massachusetts, determined to stop the foreclosures that were taking everything they'd fought for. Their rallying cry was simple: liberty and justice for all, even the poor. To the frightened elite in Boston, it looked like anarchy, a rebellion of common men threatening to undo the fragile republic. To others, it was a warning that freedom without fairness was a hollow victory. The state militia opened fire. Blood spilled on the frozen fields of Springfield, and when the rebellion was crushed, the shockwaves rippled through every state house in America. If Massachusetts could fall into chaos, who was next? If the government couldn't protect property or peace, what good was independence at all? George Washington watched from Mount Vernon, horrified. He'd hoped to live out his days in quiet retirement, but the news from the north convinced him of one terrible truth. "What has been won by the sword," he wrote, "may yet be lost to disorder." All across the colonies, the same question echoed. Was this the fate of every republic, to rise in passion and collapse in weakness? The Articles of Confederation were failing, and America was running out of time. Out of the crisis, a call went out, a meeting in Philadelphia, not to amend the system, but to replace it entirely. No one knew it then, but the gathering that followed would shape the destiny of a continent. 55 men, in one sweltering room, trying to reinvent the idea of government itself. The American Revolution was over. The summer of 1787 was hot, not just with the weather, but with the weight of history pressing down. Philadelphia shimmered under the sun as delegates from 12 states arrived, 55 men, summoned not by power, but by desperation. The Articles of Confederation had failed. The nation was drifting toward collapse. And yet, what they were about to attempt bordered on treason. They called it a convention to revise the Articles, but most knew that was a polite fiction. Behind the locked doors of the Pennsylvania State House, they were about to dismantle the government they'd fought a revolution to create. George Washington, reluctantly pulled from retirement, presided over the assembly, silent, solemn, a living symbol of unity. But it was James Madison, the small, soft-spoken scholar from Virginia, who arrived with a plan, a bold blueprint for something entirely new, a strong national government divided by branches, balanced by design. He called it the Virginia Plan. To some it was salvation, to others sacrilege. The debates turned fierce. Large states demanded power by population. Small states cried betrayal. Slavery, that unspoken fracture in the American dream, lingered in every corner of the room, haunting their compromises, staining their ideals. For 4 brutal months, tempers flared, doors slammed, and quills scratched late into candlelit nights. Outside, the city buzzed with rumor. Inside, windows were nailed shut to keep secrets from spilling into the streets. Ben Franklin, now old and frail, would sometimes rise to quiet the storms with humor, reminding them that compromising with others is the price of governing ourselves. And slowly, painfully, the shape of a new nation began to form. A government not of kings, but of laws. A republic, if they could keep it. They argued over the very soul of representation, whether the people could be trusted with power, or whether the states must protect themselves from the passions of the crowd. When the Great Compromise finally emerged, 2 houses, one for the people, one for the states, the room exhaled, exhausted but united. Yet even then, many left in doubt. When the Constitution was finally signed on September 17, 1787, only 39 men put their names to it. The rest feared it went too far, too powerful, too centralized. As the delegates departed into the autumn mist, someone asked Franklin what kind of government they had created. He smiled faintly and said the words that would echo through centuries. A republic, if you can keep it. That phrase wasn't a boast, it was a warning, because no parchment, no seal, no signature could guarantee survival. Only the people could do that. And as the ink dried on the Constitution, a new battle began, not on the fields of war, but in the hearts and minds of every American. The battle to ratify the dream. The Constitution was signed, but signing it wasn't the same as saving it, because in 1787, the United States wasn't one country yet. It was 13 experiments, still deciding if they even wanted to be united. And now, every state would have to choose whether to accept the new plan or walk away from the table entirely. What followed wasn't a debate. It was a war of words. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, launched a campaign unlike anything the world had ever seen. They wrote a series of essays, 85 in all, published in New York newspapers, defending the Constitution with reason, persuasion, and sheer brilliance. They called them the Federalist Papers. Each essay argued that liberty and strength didn't have to be enemies, that checks and balances could guard freedom better than weak government ever could. They painted the Constitution not as a cage, but as a compass. But the anti-Federalists saw something darker. To them, this new document looked like a betrayal of everything they'd fought for. They feared a distant, powerful government, one that could raise armies, collect taxes, and crush dissent. To them, the Constitution reeked of monarchy wearing republican clothes. And in taverns, in churches, in the smoky corners of print shops, that fear spread like wildfire. Patrick Henry thundered, "I smell a rat." Others warned that without explicit rights, this new government could trample the very liberties it promised to protect. For months, the states were deadlocked. Delaware ratified first, proudly and easily. But New York and Virginia, the giants, held the future in their hands. Without them, the Union would crumble before it began. As the summer of 1788 dawned, the tide turned. Persuaded by promises of a future Bill of Rights, the hesitant states finally gave their consent. And on June 21st, New Hampshire became the 9th to ratify, enough to bring the Constitution to life. But victory came not with cheers, but with relief. America had gambled everything, and won, for now. The debates had done something extraordinary. They'd proven that a nation could argue about its soul and still survive. That dissent wasn't a weakness. It was the heartbeat of democracy itself. And when the final votes were counted, a new question emerged, one no parchment could answer. Who would lead this fragile republic? The answer was waiting in the quiet fields of Mount Vernon. On a cool morning in April 1789, the city of New York awoke to the sound of church bells. Crowds lined the cobblestone streets, pressing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the sight of a man who'd never wanted the job. George Washington, hero of the Revolution, stood on the balcony of Federal Hall, not as a general this time, but as something entirely new, a president. The Constitution had given him the title, but no one yet knew what that meant. There were no traditions, no examples, no guidebook for leading a republic. Every step he took would set precedent. Every word he spoke, the first of its kind. As he placed his hand upon a borrowed Bible, the crowd fell silent. The oath was short, just 35 words. But in those few breaths, the fragile promise of the revolution became something living. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. When he finished, the people erupted, cheers echoing through the harbor, cannons firing from the battery, tears streaming down faces hardened by war and uncertainty. Washington bowed, visibly trembling. He wasn't celebrating victory. He was carrying its weight. He walked into the Senate chamber and gave his first address, humble, cautious, almost reluctant. He spoke of duty, of unity, of the sacred fire of liberty, now entrusted to every citizen. And though the room was filled with power, it was clear to all who watched that this experiment could still fail. Because America had no kings to command loyalty, no empire to enforce obedience. It had only faith, in words written on parchment, and in a man who symbolized them. That day, the government of the United States was no longer theory. It had a voice, a leader, and a beginning. But as Washington looked out over the young city, he must have known this was only the first sunrise of a nation that would spend centuries learning how to govern itself. When George Washington lowered his hand from the Bible, the crowd cheered, but the world held its breath, because on that balcony, in that fleeting spring morning of 1789, the world had witnessed something that had never truly existed before: a nation built on an idea, not on bloodline, not on conquest, but on consent. The first day of America wasn't about fireworks or parades. It was about uncertainty and faith. Faith that reason could govern passion, that liberty could survive power, that people, flawed and divided, could still choose virtue over chaos. The men who had gathered in Philadelphia months earlier were not prophets. They were gamblers, wagering everything on the belief that human nature could be contained, not by kings, but by law. And yet, the same tensions that haunted them then still echo now. The balance between liberty and order, between state and nation, between what America promised to be and what it has yet to become. Every generation since has faced its own version of that first day, standing at the crossroads between unity and division, between ideal and reality. And each time the Republic has survived, barely, held together not by perfection, but by persistence. Because the Constitution was never meant to be a monument. It was meant to be a conversation, a living argument about who we the people really are. When Washington walked back into Federal Hall that morning, the world didn't change overnight. But something far greater began. The slow, unfinished work of building a nation that believes in itself. And like so many stories we uncover here on the Dusty Ledger, it reminds us, the past is never truly past. It lingers in the promises we inherit, the questions we still ask, and the quiet truth that America's first day never really ended. It just keeps beginning.